this in the future, except for December, but starting in January, the second Tuesday of the month at the same time. And we intend to cover other topics concerning negotiations. What we have today is myself, Ken Hickey from SERB, and then we have two panelists who are experienced negotiators. Sarah Moore is a partner at Fisher and Phillips in their Cleveland office, and she is one of the best negotiators that I've experienced in my mediation practice. So I welcome Sarah. I see her picture there. So she's waving at us. And our second panelist is Amy McMillan. Amy represents teachers unions in the Northeast area of our state. She also is one of the best negotiators I've experienced. So welcome to you, Amy. And thanks for being with us today. So that's what we have. We are going to cover negotiations during this COVID crisis. We will attack it in two different ways. First, in discussing virtual negotiations and how that works, and then dealing with in-person negotiations and how that works. So that's it. Before we get started, as it's typical of me, wanted to tell a brief little story that relates to this in a different way. And it is a recapping of a negotiation I did many, many years ago in my early 30s. I was with a law firm in the Washington, D.C. area, and it was a negotiation in Jacksonville, Florida in February, which was much sought after, considering the weather in D.C. and the weather in Jacksonville. And consequently, I went down to Jacksonville early to prepare. And the first negotiation session was at the motel next to the TV station I was representing. So I drove over there, and as you probably know, in February in Florida, it's quite sunny. I had a convertible, so I was driving over with my sunglasses on, much like you're probably seeing now. And I arrived at the motel and discovered the room we had was an internal room that had very subdued lighting above, no fluorescent lights. And I wore prescription glasses. So I basically took these glasses off and started to reach for my regular glasses, and somehow I had left them back at the motel. So the only way I could read my papers was to put my glasses back on, as you see now. And this consequently threw the union negotiator at the totally off, because he could not figure why in the world I was wearing sunglasses in a dark room. And he thought that I was trying to hide something behind my eyes. So the session didn't go well, as you can imagine. So we had another session a couple of days later, and I arrived just like this with my sunglasses on, and I took them off and I put my regular glasses on. When I looked down at the other end of the table, that negotiator had a pair of sunglasses on. And I just started chuckling to myself, saying, what the heck is he doing wearing sunglasses? But this went on and on. We eventually ended up reaching a settlement And in those days, when you reached a settlement, you went to the bar and had a drink. So we went and had a drink, and he said, "Let me ask you one question." I said, "What's that, Jeff?" And he said, "What is it with those sunglasses? You wearing them one day and not wearing them?" And I said to him, "I only wore them the one day because I forgot my regular glasses." And he went, "Oh." And I only tell that story because we can read so many things into what's going on in a particular session. And the best way to find the answers to things is to ask. Uh, and this is particularly true in this time that we are now. Uh, it's it's unusual to all of us. Uh, this virtual mechanism is new to us. Wearing masks is new to us. Social distancing from people and trying to caucus is new to us. So those are the things we're looking to cover today as we go through our process. Um, we plan on being here for an hour and a half. If there are questions taking us through that, please do not hesitate. Do any questions. Uh, you submit your questions through chat to both Alicia and Scott, and they will alert me as to those, and we'll try to work those questions in as we go along. Okay, so let's get started. We'll first discuss virtual negotiations, which is held in many, many different mechanisms, but it has certain challenges and it has certain benefits. And one of my panelists is now going to offer you their thoughts.
All right, well, I guess I can get started. So Sarah and I had some discussions yesterday about what we thought were some of the challenges. And she and I have both had a little bit of experience with this brand new world of trying to do virtual negotiations. And, a lot of it came down to fear. And the first sort of fear of the unknown. And I think even I experienced that when I was first asked to start doing some virtual negotiations. There's a lot of fear involved from me as a practitioner, from the people that I work with, from the other team. And I think fear of the unknown has been a huge issue. We're all trying brand new things for the first time, and none of us are good at it. Even my little kids, I have elementary age kids who are trying to do virtual learning. They're not very good at it. I can't fix their issues. And a lot of that fear revolves around technology. Don't you agree, Sarah?
Absolutely. And when we were talking yesterday, we kind of were thinking about this fear of technology, and it boiled down to one thing. Am I going to look stupid?
Right.
And the reality is that this is new to all of us. This is not something that is intuitive. It is something that we are all learning together. And so to think that one of us is a superstar, I know, Ken, I know you want to get up and take claim to that, but to think one of us is a superstar at this stuff is just that true. We were talking about the good old days of technology and when we last felt like really awkward with technology. And do you remember AOL?
Oh yeah. I'm thinking dial-up internet, Sarah, like, when it would make the hissy noise and all of that. That's kind of how this feels.
Yeah, boom, boom, boom. It's kind of one of those, what am I getting into? And so, kind of the first piece is just jump off and do it. Even if it's beginning the process of familiarity with these platforms by, hosting a Zoom call with family and friends. Begin to play with it, begin to practice with it, to become familiar and to feel comfortable with being awkward, because it is awkward. It's not user-friendly. It's not intuitive. And, we hear sometimes in these meetings, someone comment, "Oh, go get your kid to fix it." And you've touched on that, Amy. What's your experience with that?
Oh, absolutely. I've had situations where, my kids have been able to help, and situations where my kids have not been able to help. And I think honestly, even in these meetings, I think both parties are trying to give each other an awful lot of grace. And, if I can't figure out how to share my screen, even though I've shared my screen 100 times, there's generally someone who's very generous that will say, hit those three little buttons, click on share screen, and it's like, okay, I can do this again. On top of that, I know, at least in my house, we're trying to share an awful lot of bandwidth. We've got some freezing screens. So there's a lot of need to give each other some grace in terms of internet and connectivity and bandwidth. Trying to figure out how to use different platforms is difficult. I know the first time that Ken and Sarah and I met as a team was the first time I'd used Microsoft Teams. And they're talking and they can't hear me. I can hear them, but they can't hear me. And I'm sitting Googling on my phone, how do I turn on the audio on Microsoft Teams? But thankfully, they gave me so much grace and they just waited for me. And I think that's hugely important, is understanding that settings are crazy. It's difficult to find. Each platform is going to be different. And Sarah, I agree with you. Those test calls are so helpful. I know I really was able to do this today because we'd practiced going through this platform and I'd had the opportunity to troubleshoot.
Absolutely. And practice is I think the key, because I need to learn how to be patient. I am not a patient person. The pandemic has really taught me that. I want things to happen. I want them to happen now. Can't we all get an agreement? Don't you see what I see? Come on now, catch up. And it's not like that. Like, everything is way slowed down. And if you move too quickly, you're going to miss a lot of what's going on.
Right. There's other people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you touched on that bandwidth issue, and that's so very critical for all of us to have an appreciation for. You talked about grace, and the first thing we need to do is, be authentic with kind of the place that we're in. So if we're in a space where there's a lot of pull from our internet, and we're heading into meetings, there are ways that we can support ourselves to be more accessible within the meeting. And one of those ways is to figure out how to create the pockets for ourselves to minimize the interruption, recognizing that there's going to be interruption. So those things can look like when we go to talk. If I go to talk and I turn off my video, my bandwidth is better in carrying my audio and making sure that I'm not frozen when I'm speaking. And it certainly helps that I don't show up on the screen like this, frozen in some crazy position while my voice is going, because no one's going to hear anything I'm saying with my frozen face. So, figuring out that bandwidth issue can be really important. And to the extent that you're able to carve out, when you have the meetings where you're doing all the talking, to stop other people using the bandwidth. And you face that this.
Definitely.
Yeah. So then,
I'm going to interrupt at this point just to second what you're saying, Sarah, because I was doing a mediation and I had 8 people involved and it seemed to be going very well. And I was talking away and then I heard some voice out there say, "Ken, you're frozen." And and it was like this voice from Never Land, because it was like, so what do I do now, Charlie? And uh, I just started to panic. And finally, one of the people, correctly, as you pointed out, said, "Is there a younger person in your household?" So you could learn how to do it. And eventually, I just shut it down, but I found out that it froze in shutting down, so I couldn't get back on. Uh, but there are other ways. I then made phone calls and went through my phone computer, and everybody got back together again. But it's when it occurs, and it will occur wherever you do in this thing, it's going to happen. You just have to accept it. It's sort of like being in a regular negotiations, sitting there in a room with everything going on, and you lose electricity. Yeah, it's it's just one of those events. So back to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Ken. That's a great point. The voice from God showing up as you're talking can be rather distracting. and it's hard to recover from that. But the number one thing is just to breathe and go back to what you can recall that you started with. And it's okay to rehash what you've said, because it's likely that if you've frozen, there was a lot of interruption to what you said prior to the freezing happening. So there's nothing wrong, particularly in labor relations, with revisiting what we've said, because sometimes people hear it differently, and sometimes people need to hear it differently. And we had a quick comment from someone. It all depends on how technology proficient you are, not so much an issue about age or generations. And that's so very true. Yeah.
Very true.
So then when Amy and I were talking yesterday, we thought, okay, what else are we afraid of? And so we came up with this giant bucket that we wanted to talk about. And it's about social behavior and like etiquette issues on using these platforms. And the very first choice we all make is whether we turn our cameras on or we turn them off. And Amy, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's very interesting because I know from a teacher perspective, it's nice to see faces because you can engage with them, you can check understanding, you can see if someone's nodding, if someone's making eye contact. And I know there was a set of negotiations that I did virtually, and one individual had her camera off, and it was on the management side. I was representing a group, a union group, and they were very upset that this individual's camera was off, and they felt like that there's something being hidden, that person maybe wasn't paying attention, that person wasn't invested in the conversation, because what are they doing if their camera is off? And they almost felt like the conversation wasn't valued by that individual simply because the camera was off. Now, if it had been someone on their own side, I don't know if they would have felt the same way, but I think that speaks to how that can be interpreted. And that may not have been that person's intention at all. They may have been completely engaged on the other side. Right now I can't see any of the other people in this meeting except for you and Ken. That doesn't mean that they're not there. That doesn't mean that they're not engaged, but the perception of that can have an influence on those negotiations.
Absolutely. And, we talked about one of the keys is getting these remote platforms to come alive and kind of recreate what we can't do right now, which is be in person.
Right.
And If we think about when we're in person, we can see each other. We can see what we're doing. We can see whether we're, rolling our eyes or looking out the window or looking down at our phone and, texting and emailing and not paying attention. And you're absolutely right. That camera's off. I am assuming the worst.
Absolutely. And I think unfortunately, that's what can happen. So I think when you are deciding to be in virtual negotiations, that maybe you have an understanding that, we try and be, or have our cameras on because that face-to-face interaction is that important that we feel like the need for virtual negotiations are occurring. And I think that's maybe part of some ground rules that you and the parties have to decide on when you're preparing for some of those virtual negotiations.
Yeah. And Michael made a great comment just now. He said, would it help to set some basic agreed expectations about use of the platform up front? Absolutely. And Ken, do you have, from your perspective, some basic expectations that you communicate as a mediator to the parties?
Yes, thanks, Sarah. It's especially with the virtual environment is that I found at the outset of doing them, if you put everybody together on one meeting, it's not unlike sort of a meeting when I come in as a mediator. Everybody's together. What are the issues? You all tell me what the issues are. And then you just sort of stare at me like, what are you going to do now? And I've discovered that part of that mediation process is everybody going into separate rooms where they have just either the union reps or the employer reps in the room. And I find if that's announced at the beginning to everybody that we're going to go through that process and that I will be available, and all you have to do is contact me either online or by virtue of calling on another mechanism. But to me, and I'd like to hear the two of you comment, I notice quite frequently people, which is back to the original subject, have this fear of talking into a screen. And even though they're with you, Amy, or you, Sarah, and if you were on the phone, they maybe ba 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 ba. They all of a sudden see themselves there, and they just don't join in. And how do you get them to join in? Because I can sit there at times and say, okay, what's going on? And there's silence.
That's a great question, Ken. And I think with time you become more comfortable with this platform. And Amy and I were talking yesterday about the neck up syndrome, right? So yeah. We've gone from like a space of being able to read people in real time with them in front of us, where we have the full visual of them. We can see their facial expressions. We can see how they're using their body language with the nonverbals. Are they folding their arms? Are they open, in terms of writing stuff down? Like, how are they holding themselves? In this virtual platform, we've got neck up. And we're expected to read from that. And so as you're seeing with the interaction here, I have to act as if I am in a room with you right now, real time, and talk with you. And it's okay to use my hands. It's okay to express myself. It's okay to lean in, lean out, kind of move around. It's okay to ask you questions, to try to get you to talk. We need to take the time to begin to develop a comfort level with the people who are participating, where we can open our mouths and like share stuff and realize that we can get the same quality of being able to interact on these remote platforms as we do in person. It just takes some time and practice. Amy?
I would agree. I think that even my team meetings that I could have possibly had in person if we were all 6 feet apart, we still met on using virtual meetings simply because I wanted us to have that practice. I wanted them to have the familiarity and to feel comfortable seeing themselves on screen. Now, for a lot of the people that I work with, my teachers are teaching virtually online. And the people that, in some of my other groups are doing virtual visits with their clients. So they do have a little bit more familiarity with it than someone who may not be in that position. But I think encouraging people to simply practice, and even like Sarah said, have some calls with your friends and family. I think people are getting better and better at it as time goes on. I know that may not be a great thing to hear, that we're going to be continuing this and everyone's getting really familiar with it. But I think it helps negotiations along to have people that are becoming more and more familiar.
Yeah. And, I wanted to share with everyone a couple of the comments that came in, because they're the exact opposite in terms of experience with the remote platform. And I think it's really important for us all to hear. So Gail shared with us that we recently settled an agreement with a union with whom we have an adversarial relationship. Virtual negotiations took much of the drama from the interaction and helped us get things done. We love it. And now the flip of that, from Brad, we finished negotiations a few weeks ago. While the outcome was positive, I believe it took nearly twice as long as typical, due in my opinion to the virtual element. And, that's the reality. You have one extreme or the other. And Amy, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would agree. I think I think a lot of it depends on relationship, and where your relationships are. I think one of the pitfalls that you and I talked about was that things don't come across virtually the same way they do in person. And I know I had an experience in virtual negotiations where a board attorney, we were talking about turnover rates. And I have been in negotiations with this particular board attorney, and anytime we talk about turnover, his first reaction is, well, we have bad employees, and that's why we have such high turnover rates. And normally in a room, you can see his body language and you can understand that he's really kind of making a joke out of it. Well, I could instantly see my folks' faces fall. They were just shocked he would say that. They were angry. And I had to pull them aside into a caucus and say, guys, like, it's okay. And in the moment, I said, oh, you're so funny. That's such a great joke. But, we don't have bad employees. Let's focus on the issue of turnover. And I think that is part of the dynamic that's involved in either a positive or a negative outcome. Is, do you have that relationship, and how do those things come across in a virtual setting? It's very different.
How do you, if I could interrupt, how do you do a caucus?
So interestingly, the platform that we used was a Ring Central platform. And we used a mediator as a facilitator. And they were able to, you could ask for a caucus and they would take everyone virtually and put you in one room, union in one room, management in the other, and it gave you the ability to caucus. It was pretty fantastic.
Sarah?
Yep. So I'm going to flip us back to this screen, this computer we have in front of us. In talking about this this social etiquette and behavior bucket. And, Sherry commented and shared with us just a few minutes ago that we need to learn about presenting ourselves virtually. And that all begins with how we choose to interact with our computer. And so, for example, if I'm talking and I do this, you're pretty distracted, aren't you?
Right? I'm pretty distracted, Sarah.
Right. Now, wouldn't it be a lot better if, you all were talking and instead of me doing what I just did, I turned my camera off, I took my sip of water, and then I turned my camera back on, right? It's having those basic pieces down in terms of I need to pay attention to how I am present on the virtual platform. I want to be the least disruptive possible to not distract from the conversation, because we all love shiny things. And I like to watch the shiny things. And, if Ken's going to start interacting with his frog behind him, I'm going to want to watch that interaction to see what the heck that guy's up to. But if he's just sitting and paying attention like a schoolboy does right now, I have nothing to look at. I have to continue with the substantive piece. So, Amy, what are your thoughts in terms of just that basic of controlling your computer and how you present yourself?
I agree 100%. And, I'm even thinking about the things that are maybe on your wall behind you. Those types of things that what are you presenting to everyone? Are you presenting something that is professional, or like you said, are you presenting something shiny that people are going to be interested in instead of the actual message? And I had to learn that. I think, it's easier to focus on, the conversation when there's nothing exciting going on in the background.
But we all love that excitement. And let's talk about the field trip.
The field trip. So my house is a little crazy. I have kids and dogs and all of that. And, in the hour and a half that Sarah and I were talking to each other, I had interruptions by my 7-year-old son, and I had my 9-month-old bulldog puppy come down for a visit. And it was driving me crazy. So I had to take Sarah on a field trip to take the dog upstairs and close the baby gate. And, as Sarah, and I'm apologizing and I'm going, Sarah, this is the worst thing ever, because not only am I interrupting our conversation and I'm distracting from what we're trying to do, but I'm also now taking you on a field trip and showing you, my basement, and, we're walking through the house. And if I were on your end, I'd probably be getting seasick.
Absolutely. And it's funny when you're one-on-one, you might be able to handle that. But if you're in a group setting, beyond that 2 threshold, really have to pay attention to making sure that your computer stays stationary. It's not on your knee jiggling. As Sherry pointed out, you're not taking people with you when you're walking around the house trying to go get a piece of paper you may need, or go get, a refresher on your water, or corral the dog. Like, people don't want to see that, and to your point, they could get physically ill, they could get motion sick, and you certainly don't want to have that going on. So minimize those field trips. Go ahead, Amy.
Right. Well, and I think that's maybe to our next point, which was that, the fact is, while we all do our best, we have no control right now. There's no control in this world of anything, it seems. So I think in that token, we all do have to give each other some grace in the fact that we're all afraid of those things happening. And honestly, I told my husband this morning, I'm like, keep the dog away, keep the children away. I've got something important I have to do today. But, we all do have to accept that some of that stuff is going to happen. And in the negotiations I've been in, it happens, and there's nothing we can do about it. Kids come in, pets come in, all of those, the lawn service starts and nobody can hear anything. But again, I think part of our job too is to refocus quickly after those things happen. And like you said earlier, that might be a time to recap. So, okay, tell your, glad and cute dog. However, what I was saying was this, and this. Would you agree, Sarah?
Absolutely, absolutely. And, one of the things that all three of us have going on right now, and we get gold stars, is we have solid walls behind us. Can't stress enough how important it is to have that wall behind you, because then you're controlling the background completely. If you are in front of a doorway, anything's possible, and anything will happen. And we've all seen kind of those virtual videos, that go viral. But it's happened in real time, with some of us right now, in our experiences. I've seen, the half naked person go through a background. Not a fun situation for the person, who's got that behind them. It's important to, control what we can. And quite frankly, in controlling what we can, we are in fact communicating something about ourselves. And Amy, you've got a great story about one of your negotiations and that bloodhound. If you could share that, that'd be great.
Oh, love this. This is honestly, I think, the best thing that came out of a recent set of negotiations that were done virtually. So the board attorney was sitting in his office. We're in the midst of negotiations, and this big-headed, beautiful bloodhound comes in and waltzes into our negotiations, and he's absolutely adorable. And one of my team members, my union team members, was like, oh my gosh, I love bloodhounds. I've been looking to get a bloodhound. Look at your bloodhound. What's your bloodhound's name? And we have this big, conversation about this bloodhound. And, and then, he gets the dog out and we get back to work. But then during our caucus, the union member says to me, do you think that you could ask that board attorney if he would give me the number of his breeder, because I've been looking for a bloodhound? And so I passed the message along, and now they're in bloodhound groups together on Facebook, and she's going to get a bloodhound from the same breeder. But that took that board attorney and it humanized him to my team. So all of a sudden he went from a board attorney who was an enemy or, on the opposing team, and turned him into a human. And I think that humanizing factor is huge. Those people that we may not have really looked at as a person, showing us their human side. We all know Ken loves Ohio State, but seeing his office and some of those things really humanizes someone that maybe you didn't know that much about. And it creates a connection.
I agree. And Ken, have you seen that as an important ingredient in the work that you're doing remotely?
There is no question about that it is something as I use as a mediator in talking with everybody, is to find things what we have in common. And once I find that you establish a relationship. And once you establish a relationship, negotiation becomes easier. Not easy, but easier. And I was going to segue into the in-person by virtue of I've had a number of situations in mediations where one side or the other decides to gather with one camera and one mic, like in a conference room. And so there's 5 of them in a room and they log on through that mechanism. And I see them sitting there. The unfortunate thing about that is that they're all wearing masks because they're in the room together, which leads us into the in-person. And to me, it is like taking the virtual mechanism with the current in-person mechanism of distance and mask, and you put them together, and it is very, very difficult because it's establishing and getting a relationship and a connection where you cannot hear nor see what a person is reacting is to me one of the most difficult things. And that's where I'd like to hear what you all have to say of, have you had in-person ones with the masks and the distancing, and what have been the advantages or the challenges?
Before we head there, could we just jump back for a second, Ken? Because we had a couple comments that I want to make sure
Sure.
that we share out. So there were a couple comments on virtual backgrounds, and that those are available on most of the platforms. And Pam shared that with us. And then Jorge shared with us all a link to Microsoft Teams, and an article about Microsoft Teams now lets you use your own custom images as your virtual background. So, in that control your space behind you, those are some nice pieces in terms of virtual backgrounds. But just real quick, have you encountered any issues with virtual backgrounds, Amy?
I have not, but I love the idea of a custom background because, again, to me, that's the start of a great conversation. Like, hey, I love your background. Tell me about it. And maybe that's a picture that you took on vacation when you were, in the Bahamas, or you were in Maine. And especially since none of us are going anywhere anytime soon, I think that's a great way, again, to create a connection, to humanize the people that you're working with. I think that's a really great idea.
Yeah. And it's been pointed out, and I actually have had this experience. Sometimes people disappear with those virtual backgrounds, so you need to be careful with it. If you move too much, there becomes this space around you that kind of consumes you, and then you kind of, the person kind of goes in and out. So if you're using them, just pay attention to your movement and realize that you may need to restrict your movement because it could interfere with how people are viewing you. Yeah. Do you want to talk about microphones being off and on before we delve into the other category?
Sure.
So, Amy, what are your thoughts in terms of microphones on, microphones off with all the people who are participating in the negotiations?
Yeah, I think it can get very noisy unless, like the situation we're in now, your microphone's off unless you're talking. I think, especially feedback issues, and I've experienced some of that. And it can make things very difficult. It makes it difficult to focus. And I think if you can keep that microphone off unless you're talking, I think that's a really, really great idea. Would you agree?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, paying attention to putting it on and off is key because of kind of the noise issues around your home, and those can come into play very quickly without you having any notice that it's about to happen.
Oh,
And
you mean more loss of control, Sarah?
yeah, just a bit. So very important. And, as we're moving into the trust issue that Ken identified, I think the last piece, Amy, that we talked about yesterday was the on that loss of control. You don't know when an emergency is happening. So please make sure that your bottom matches your top when you're sitting in your chair. And did you want to kind of share with us your thoughts on that?
Oh, definitely. I think when you're in the middle of negotiations, you really don't want to have to stand up because your puppy runs in or something happens, you spill your coffee on yourself and, maybe you're in your pajama pants or maybe something else. No, just be prepared for any emergency. So, a nice pair of even leggings are better than your pajama pants or your boxers or something else like that. Just as a word of caution.
Yeah. So,
And if I could add before you move on, Sarah, that, and you and Amy just did it, is if a limited number of people have the mic on, as is in this is going on, Sarah, Amy, and I have our mics on. Hearing interreactive laughing, as the two of you just did a minute ago, brings a humanness to the virtual program that is not there if ever, at least in my experience, if everybody's muted. And that's why when I usually mediate, I tell everybody I am not going to be unmuted at any point in time. And somebody says something and I laugh at it and I watch the reactions, and everybody reacts differently and it becomes more human. So
I
back to
agree
you.
with you. I agree with you, Ken. I think, the spontaneity of the moment and how we're all reacting to one another is sometimes lost on these remote platforms, and to the extent that we are comfortable and it doesn't interfere with the conversation, having that microphone on can be really helpful in capturing those moments and bringing the meeting to life a little bit. I absolutely agree. Amy?
I agree as well. I think part of what everyone is missing right now, and I don't know about you, but I miss that human interaction. I miss hearing about the people that I work with's children and their days and how things are going with them at work. So I do appreciate certainly some of that human connection coming through, whether it's a laugh, whether it's an appropriately timed joke that doesn't come off the wrong way. All of those things are really good for making this virtual world seem a little bit more like our real world.
Absolutely. And now we're going to jump into where Ken wanted to lead us to, and we thank you for that, this idea of trust. And how do we build trust on a remote platform? Because, that's a key ingredient to the work that we all do. And with this remote platform, as Ken pointed out, whether it's wearing the sunglasses in a real life setting, or whether it's being on a remote platform and not having a camera on, whether it's being in person and having a mask on, there is the critical ingredient of trust that we are challenged with creating, whether we're on a remote platform or whether we're in a live platform right now during the pandemic. And so starting with the remote platform, Amy, what are your thoughts on how to begin to build trust on a remote platform, and what are the things kind of that pop out as no-nos that can impact that process?
So, Sarah, I agree with you. I think it's really tough to build trust on a virtual platform. Again, we struggle with the body language. If you're in person, the masks. But I think, one of the things that is really important to me is, you're doing. I think that's, you and I talked about that yesterday. Sarah and I had a conversation. I only have one computer screen, but Sarah has two. And, when Sarah and I are talking and I see Sarah look off in a different direction, my reaction, not if I didn't know Sarah, would be that Sarah wasn't paying attention to me. And I would feel pretty darn vulnerable having a tough conversation with someone who I didn't feel like was invested in our conversation. So, one of the things that Sarah and I discussed was how she manages the double screens, and how, she manages making that work. Do you mind sharing that, Sarah? Because I think that's really important.
Absolutely. Yeah, it comes down to being very authentic and honest with the people in the room about what you're doing. So if we think about it, if I'm in a live room and I have my computer in negotiations and I'm typing on my computer, and everyone automatically assumes that I am working on the negotiations that we're doing, and they'd be correct. um, but when we're remote, you see me move my head and turn, you're not going to automatically assume that I am engaged in what's going on. So some of the techniques that I use is if I'm looking down and it's at paper for the negotiations, I try to make sure that you see papers as I am working, So if I'll realize all of a sudden, no, I'm looking down, I've been looking down a little bit, I'm going to move my papers. So you can see that I'm working. I'm not sitting here with a phone in my hand, looking at my phone and texting or checking emails. So that's one thing I do with the papers and looking down. When it comes to the other screen, if I'm looking at the other screen, I will toggle between that and the camera, and I will often mention, hold on, I'm opening that document right now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, the computer's taking a second. Like, people know that I've got another screen going, that there's something happening in this line of vision. If someone sends an email, hold on, let me check my email. Okay, I've got it. I'm opening it up now. I talk people through what I'm doing so you can see that I'm engaged, and it doesn't take long to do it, and other people feel like they're part of it. And all of a sudden you start to realize that other people start to do that too, which is a really cool piece because we're all talking about what we're doing. Ken, what's your experience?
I I agree with you 1,000%. And I've had the experience with you in a couple of mediations where, and I'd like you to mention that here, where we were in the midst of a discussion of whether to settle or not settle, and then you brought up on screen a chart, which you then proceeded to go through the chart and say, what if we did this and what if we did that? So, and to me, I watched it happen, and I watched your team sort of end up in the position we all wanted them to end up in a very comfortable way. And so why don't you explain part of that?
Sure. So I expected that Ken would bring that up. And so one of the things I've learned with this remote platform is we can use kind of we can channel our inner teacher, right? We have a live chalkboard in front of us and we've got everyone's rapt attention if we use it. So I could right now sit here and I could all of a sudden, if it will let me, and I'm going to ask Scott if you can make sure that it works. Can you see my screen right now?
We cannot.
Okay. And I'm trying to do
there,
this.
now we can. You're good.
Okay. So what I did with a mediation that Ken and I were involved in, I was running into difficulties. And this is kind of a template of what I did. I created an objectives part and I identified what the client was identifying to me as their objectives. And then I had an analysis part where I had the item, each of the items that we were going through in trying to reach a resolution, the pros of that item, the cons of that item, and then whether the objectives that were outlined above were met. And then, if they were not met, I had Ken actively involved in that conversation. He didn't know that was coming. He in real time adapted to it. He did a wonderful job because he was able to support me with my own people in bringing his experience to bear. And they had the benefit of Ken as a resource to say, yes, in my years of experience, in labor and now as a SERB mediator, here's what I've seen in terms of your risks, with respect to moving forward or not. Or here's what I see in terms of the pros and the cons that are identified. Oops, Sarah, you're missing one. Here's another one. It was an interactive conversation where everyone became vested in the outcome because we're working on this document together. And so in real time, I'm typing and I'm filling it out. And by the end, we get to the place of, okay, what are the risks in not achieving a resolution? Now I'm in a position where I have an informed client who has benefited from Ken being able to bring his experience as a mediator into the mix, and we're able to reach a resolution. And Ken, did you want to share kind of from your perspective what that was like to be put on the hot seat like that? Because you did a great job.
It's not unusual that we are that way as mediators, but what I found, it just fascinated me because what it did was it centered everybody onto those items, and it was a mechanism. And when you watched it happening and you watched Sarah typing in real time, and then all of a sudden the sheet filled out and it led you to a certain conclusion. And I watched members of the team that were going through that just sort of seconding things they were not necessarily agreeing with earlier because of other considerations. And it's just those are the things I think that you can do virtually if you practice it, get able to do it, and it makes you feel that you're really together in the same room. You're not on this virtual mechanism. I mean, it was fantastic.
And if you don't mind me asking, do you feel like that collaboration built greater trust in your process? Because I think that would for me.
It certainly did. It was in a caucus setting, and we were able to work through the issues pretty efficiently. And it took a little bit of time to get the buy-in with the stakeholders who weren't at the table, but my people had the information they needed to be able to have those critical conversations. Yeah.
Right.
And I was going to flip us over, if it's all right, into the in-person setting in this pandemic, because there are a few of us, even with the spikes going up, who find ourselves in that space of either doing hybrid negotiations or doing in-person negotiations. And so, Amy, did you want to share kind of your thoughts in terms of the in-person negotiations?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges of in-person negotiations is fear. Would you agree?
Absolutely, but a different kind of fear.
Yes. This is a different kind of fear. So maybe this isn't the fear of technology, but there's definitely some fear, and I'm going to be very honest. I unfortunately received a COVID diagnosis on Monday, and the 4 people that I was in a meeting with last Wednesday are all either ill or receiving their COVID test because they have symptoms. And we did everything we possibly could. We wore masks. We sat 6 feet apart. We all used hand sanitizer, and somehow all ended up ill. And I think there are a lot of people who are very afraid of that. And thankfully, I'm doing very well. I'm sitting with all of you here today. So, I'm one of the lucky people who are doing very well. But I think their fear is very well founded. And I think that's one of the biggest concerns that I think anyone has with meeting in person. And I think can change the dynamic. Are you really speaking openly? Is everyone speaking? Are you fear makes it so you aren't really as invested? Are you worried about your mask, the person across from you wearing their mask, touching surfaces? I think there's a lot of fear wrapped up in any of those in-person meetings.
And, we talked yesterday about being in person and how sometimes it can be difficult just breathing, and we just had a guest share with us about, the mask wearing fatigue is real. Absolutely. Sitting for hours with that mask on, I don't care if you've got it just looped around your ears or if you got one of those cool bands, that pulls the stuff, like it is hard wearing that thing for hour after hour after hour. And you simply aren't paying attention in the way that you would be if you didn't have the mask on. And so how do you deal with the mask fatigue issue, Amy?
Honestly, I have one of those fun things, that the little loops that go on the back, and and I talk about with my people that it's really important. We're all working to keep each other healthy. And I think it's difficult. I know the idea of a mask break sounds lovely, but I don't encourage taking them. And my preference is to have shorter meetings when I have to be in person to prevent that mask fatigue. So maybe instead of a 6-hour marathon session, maybe we meet for 2 hours today, and then we meet for a few more hours another day. Simply to avoid that mask fatigue and to keep everyone from being with each other for too long.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with you on the, having shorter sessions. But I will share with you how, from my experience, it's so important to get buy-in before you even enter the room in terms of how are we all going to behave. So getting the commitment to the CDC guidelines, getting the commitment to spacing within the room, using a room that's large enough to allow for that spacing, agreeing that everyone's going to wear masks, having hand sanitizer, taking a look at ventilation, and making sure that, I've had some negotiation rooms where fans are brought in just to keep air circulating in and out of that room. Doors are held ajar. Who was in that room before? Are cleaning, has cleaning occurred before people enter it? Is cleaning occurring after people leave it? I've had situations going into negotiations where, the union is planning a demonstration outside of the buildings that you're entering into, and working with the union to make it safe for the people who are actually going into the negotiations to feel safe, not having to walk a gauntlet to get into the darn building. And so, having all of those things in place is like kind of the first hurdle. And then the second hurdle is actually following through and doing the things that we promised we'd do. So when you get into the room, Amy, we called it the cool kid syndrome.
Yeah.
Did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I know maybe I know I've seen this, maybe some of you have seen this. But someone eventually pulls their mask down just to get a breather. And then the first person does it, and they're the cool kid, and everyone's like, "Oh, I want to be like the cool kid. I'm gonna take I'm hot. I'm gonna take my mask down and get a breather." And then all of a sudden, that's where everybody is, and that's not where we should be. I know we talked a lot about, we need to make sure that we're following those CDC guidelines. And I know everyone's in a different place regarding mask wearing. Some people believe it's necessary, like me, other people do not. But I think we need to make sure that we are following those CDC guidelines and really making sure that we're respectful of where everyone else is at. If everyone wants to be wearing, if everyone's wearing masks, we all should be wearing masks. We shouldn't be pulling our masks down. And maybe we need to remind each other to, make sure that we're protecting each other as part of our relationship and part of respect for each other.
Part of I think the challenge within the room with these masks is extending that grace that we talk about in the remote setting into the physical setting. So that looks like if I can't hear you, because you're halfway across the room talking through a mask, it's okay for me to say, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Could you speak up? I always am hopeful when I say that the person on the other end isn't going to choose to take the mask down to talk, rather that they will raise their voice and realize that it might take a few tries to raise that voice and to be comfortable with that raised voice. But that's just what we need to do, in order for people to stay safe and comfortable within the rooms. Are there other things, Amy, that you've noticed in that respect?
The masks definitely make those facial expressions hard to read. The body language is still there, but your facial expressions aren't. And maybe there's a little facial expression with your eyebrows or your eyes, but most of what I normally read comes from the place that is covered up by that mask. So that makes reading people's faces so much more difficult, and I have to be more careful to watch for the subtle things. So maybe your eyebrows are going up, or maybe when you smile, your around your eyes crinkles up. But I find it very difficult to read people wearing masks, and I've had to start relying on not just the really easily observable body language. It's much more nuanced. Would you agree?
I absolutely agree. I think that the nonverbals with masks are different and they're very subtle, and it's hard to describe, but it's how people are choosing to sit in their chairs. Whether they've got the arms crossed or not, how they're leaning in the chairs, how they're reacting in real time in terms of moving their body to when someone says something. People do communicate still. It's just a different way. It's with the whole body. And I can say, there is a freedom with these masks. I can now make expressions behind them that I would never make in person. And
I would agree.
Yeah. And I'm hoping when we go back live that, that doesn't happen automatically. But it's just a very different way of interacting and learning how to read people. But it's doable.
Well, and I think, on my end, I've tried to make my own nonverbal cues more apparent, to try and make sure that I'm transmitting the right message, not only to people across the table, but even to my own people. So I'm finding myself nodding my head more and, leaning in to show that I'm listening, because I think that's, those nonverbals are really important to making people feel comfortable in difficult conversations. So I think because they can't see my face, I'm working to make sure that I put extra effort into my nonverbals. And honestly, anyone else who can do that, I would really appreciate it.
Look, if I may make a comment, that in some of my training sessions, there is a test that's on the internet, um, and I can't remember now the name of it. But if you went in Google and put the eye test for emotion, the test that's on there, and you can go through and see expressions that are strictly eyes, and they ask you to select one of four things as to what those eyes mean. And it's a wonderful test to take because it, it really teaches you in looking at people and detecting sort of what their feelings are based on just their eyes. And I find I find that is even more necessary these days. So, but as you're going along, Scott or Alicia, if you have any questions that Amy and Sarah need to address, because we got about 20 minutes left, and if not, we'll just continue along. So
We
Before
do
we-
have a question from Sherry for Amy, but I can get to that once you're done.
no, go ahead.
When Amy was talking, Sherry asked, now that you know that the meeting infected so many people, would you agree to another one in the future?
You know, I don't think so. I kind of think I've learned my lesson. You know, we were in some, it was disciplinary hearings. And, you know, I feel a very strong obligation to represent my members to the best of my ability. But I recognize that, you know, we're putting our health in danger. And, you know, for me, I'm very lucky. I'm doing very, very well. But I know not everyone is that lucky. And, you know, it's very difficult for me to know that I then put my family at risk. And, you know, I put a friend of mine at risk. And that is never my intention. That was not never meant to be that way. I thought we were doing the best we could do in the light of the situation. But you know, I think virtual visits are going to be pretty important for me for moving forward for a while. I was really happy to hear that Pfizer's got a vaccine. So
Great. Any other questions there?
Sophia is wondering if you might be able to at some point let us know what the eye test is. And if you're able to get that to us in the future, we can probably send that out to all the people that are interested in it.
Yes, I will, by the end of today, go on and find out what it is, and I will get it to Scott and Alicia on SERB, and they will get it out to everybody. Promise.
And then we'll all wear our sunglasses when we're near you.
I have to make a comment on that. Is I was the one exception was an in-person negotiation, and there was an individual for the union who one day was very upset with what was going on, and it was difficult to detect that until it came out in
There
the
he
light.
is frozen.
Right. Uh, but then when a good wage offer was made, I just wanted to walk over and pull his mask down because I know he had to be smiling. But those are the things I think, Sarah, you mentioned we can't see. One of the things as we go along the questions, and it relates back to the virtual, and both of you, Amy and Sarah, know I'm bringing this up because it's important to me as a mediator, is, when we reach agreement, how we effectuate it. Generally, when I mediate cases in person and I'm out there and the parties reach agreement, I never leave until a document is executed and signed, because I've always experienced situations where if I say, okay, they have agreed, they'll draft it, and I leave, it takes forever. And how do we deal with that in the virtual environment?
I can share my experience with that. And so I had a mediation where Ken was kind enough to send over the SERB template of a settlement agreement. And so in real time, as we were working through mediating the case, after going through that objectives component that I shared earlier, I, with my team, created that template in real time, put it up to them, and we reviewed that together, and then created the exhibit, which was the proposed resolution with the specific terms for the union for review. And so in that fashion, we were able to capture in real time what was going on, get it in writing, get that over to Ken. And then when we got that to Ken, Ken carried that to the union. And so that was able to support not losing momentum and making sure that we were able to bring that across the finish line as quickly as possible using the tools that were available to us. Amy, what's your experience been?
So I've had some great experiences using Google Docs while we're in virtual meetings. The great thing about Google Docs is everyone can see who's typing, what's being done in real time. And we were discussing what the language was going to look like while one person is doing the typing. And it's like, you know, we had some conversations about, well, that's not quite the wording we want. So then we stop, we discuss what's going to get the real meaning of what we all intended. And those honestly have been some of the best language that I think this group that I worked with has ever created, because they took the time to create it together, to make sure that everyone understood what every word meant, and that both parties then had an awful lot of buy-in to execute that language moving forward. That was their language. That wasn't something an attorney wrote. That wasn't something I wrote. This was their language they created together, and they all knew exactly what every word of that meant because we talked about every single word.
Ken, could you share with us where you see at SERB things going relative to remote platforms continuing to be utilized, and kind of what the future looks like over the next few months?
I wish I could tell you where it's leading. It was interesting when I was talking to the two of you yesterday, when I was asking, what are you seeing for the future? I think both of you confirmed to me that you're seeing it continuing more and more in the virtual framework. And I just expect that that's going to continue for a while. It seems to me that when people, maybe after today, people taking it on and doing planning sessions with the virtual environment and getting more comfortable with it and more comfortable with the various platforms, that while I would prefer to see it as, because I'm an oldster and I've done everything in person, this is where we are right now. So, and that but before you two comment on that, as Sarah mentioned, I went on my other computer, and the eye test is called Reading the Mind in the Eyes. Reading the Mind in the Eyes. And it's by Roman Krasnarek. And if you go on and put that on, the test is right there. So go ahead, back to you.
Yeah, Ken, I would agree. I know in our discussion yesterday, I'm going to be honest, I miss people. I miss seeing the people that I work with. I really miss the in-person. But I think for right now, the safest place that we can be, and like I said, I learned my lesson, is to do it virtually. I think part of part of my job as a practitioner is going to be learning how to do a better job in this new world and learning how to create connection and trust. The things that I do in person that I feel like I do really well in person, I'm learning how to do that online. And boy, is it a steep learning curve.
I agree with you. I too look forward to the day that we're back together live and in person. I think it's going to be a while, and we kind of just have to adapt with what's going on now till we get to that point. But that said, there was a nice comment from Sophia that just came in, and she said, we're hearing that some are opting to extend negotiations to wait out COVID. What's your thought on that, Amy?
Well, I know I've had a number of contract extensions that happened over the summer. And I think over the summer, there was a lot of hope that, we'd get into the fall and things would be different. Fortunately, reality is setting in that this is how we're going to be doing negotiations moving forward. And I think I have learned a lot about what I need to do to help my groups feel comfortable doing that. And one of the things that I think is really beneficial is the practice and is also some training. Let's look at these platforms and how they work, and let's take it for a dry run. And we're not negotiating anything, but we're just trying this out, to create that buy-in that this is going to work equivalent to the way regular negotiations work. It's not going to be exactly the same. It's definitely different, but we're still going to get a positive result. How do you feel, Sarah?
Yeah, I feel the same way. I've had a lot of clients that have extended or have limited negotiations in terms of the issues, down to the core issues. I think there's a recognition that the financials are impacted significantly in the public sector. And so because of that, everyone has kind of a reason, behind choosing to extend, because it kind of just gets us through. We're all in the lifeboat. We all want to stay that way. And so, I have seen a lot of extensions. One of the things that I know we wanted to hit, and we've got a few minutes remaining, we wanted to talk about proposal exchanges in both the physical setting and in the remote setting, and how we've seen that play out. And Amy, did you want to take us through your experience on that?
Yeah, definitely. So everyone's avoiding paper, and it's not wise to be sending paper copies back and forth of things to each other. And very honestly, that's been a difficult thing for me to deal with, because when I negotiate, I color code my paper based on the day's negotiation session. So, today's a green day, tomorrow's a blue day, it's puce on Wednesday. So that's part of my organizational tool. That's how I negotiate. And it makes it easier to say to someone, go look at the green proposal from yesterday. So it's very, very difficult not to be able to use some of those tools that I rely on, to help me, help my team, and honestly, to help the other side. So there's definitely that I can't use paper because we don't want to be handing anything to each other. So a lot of what we do is what is sharing your screen, or sharing a document that everyone can see, and then also emailing a hard copy. There are people who love to see a screen share but can't focus on it, and so they need a hard copy that they print out And I think the other big part of that is sending it out in a respectful time manner. Please don't send things out to me 2 minutes before we're supposed to start negotiating, because that doesn't leave me enough time to print what I need, or anyone else who may want a hard copy to be able to do that. So, I like to send things out in a timely manner. I usually try and do about 6 hours beforehand, just to be respectful of the fact that, everyone needs time to prepare themselves.
And I've experienced the same thing, in terms of minimizing the paper. The email is a nice vehicle for timely exchanging things. Lisa Reed commented, Google Docs works great for going back and forth, which Amy, you had indicated is one of the vehicles you use as well. So there's lots of different ways to creatively address it. But it's interesting because the technology is being used in both settings to support on the proposal exchange. And Ken, we've got about 4 minutes left. What do you want to do with it?
I'm going to remain quiet and listen to the two of you, because I continue to learn so many things.
Well, Amy, do you have some final thoughts?
Well, I guess, from my own experience, one of the things that I would really encourage people, is, as much as you feel like there's a need for in-person, I would really encourage you to do things virtually and try and learn some techniques, and hopefully you've gathered a few from us, to build that trust and build those relationships so you can do things virtually. Because, one of our thoughts yesterday was, the question was, is there a benefit to meeting in person? And we both agreed that was a hard no, unless you wanted to be meeting in person more with your doctor.
I agree.
Right.
And the only thing I would add that I think we didn't hit was on the hybrid setting very quickly. And for those of you who are trying hybrid, best advice, for those who are participating, who are in the physical room together, the group of people, try, because those people will need masks on, and you think it's hard reading people in masks physically in the same room. It's even harder when they're on a screen with 5 people in masks. And so, if you're going to do hybrid, have a physical space for your people who are meeting physically, but try to have them each on their own computers in separate rooms, because the feedback issue will exist if they're all in the same room. And that begs the question, why are you meeting anyway? Why not just do it remotely?
Sarah, I entirely agree. I attended a meeting yesterday where I was on a laptop facing a room full of masked individuals. And it was very difficult to, first of all, hear who was talking, to understand who was talking, and really to follow the conversation. I found it incredibly difficult. I'm hearing them, but I'm seeing movement, and then I'm also seeing everyone else in the room moving, shuffling papers. It's very, very difficult. So I agree with you, Sarah. I would really encourage, one person per screen and meet virtually.
Hey, let me add it at the end that when I started doing this mediating cases in June, I can tell you without question, I was more against it than probably anybody you could envision, that it wasn't going to work. It's absolutely ridiculous. How does all this stuff work? And that is a person just resistant to what changes are going on. And I've been dragged, I guess is the word, or drug into this mechanism, and now I've embraced it. There's no question like Amy and Sarah and I did last night at 4:30, had a conversation, and I put it on Microsoft Teams, and the three of us were there and had a discussion, and I find it much better than any phone conversation. I mean, it is, if you get yourself into it and accept it and really visualize the two people you're talking to, because you see them there, it can really be, in my mind, the equivalent of an in-person meeting. Granted, Sarah, the camera doesn't show what's going down, of somebody crossing their feet and kicking at you or whatever. But yeah, it does provide that necessary impetus of people reacting with people to achieve solutions. And if it's the way we have to go, as I've always said in negotiations, it always changes. What it was 50 years ago is not where it is now, but it's the new way of doing it. So, and I think we've reached the end of our time. I just want to thank Sarah and Amy for just the fabulous presentation that they put together. And, if we all could clap, then I'd all clap at this point. So closing comments from you two ladies?
I just appreciate you allowing us to take some of everyone's time and share, our voyages into this unknown world, because I think everyone's in the same boat right now, and I think it's reassuring to hear that other people are having those same experiences, and that we're all trying really hard to do the best we can do for the people we work with.
And I'd just like to thank Amy. I've enjoyed getting to know you. We didn't know each other before this, and I'm glad to have made this connection. And Ken, thank you to you and everyone over at SERB in the mediation section for the opportunity to be of service to y'all and to the folks that we all serve in the state.
Great. Thanks, everyone. We will end it. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.